Mr. Mercer, your barn is in violation of the Clearfield Ridge Community Standards, Section 4, Subsection 7, governing exterior color harmonization, and you have 30 days to repaint or face daily assessment fees of $150. That was Sandra Vole, HOA, president of the Clearfield Ridge subdivision, standing in my gravel driveway on a Tuesday morning in October with a clipboard pressed to her chest like a laminated shield. She had never set foot on my property before. She drove a white SUV with a vanity plate that read CLRFLD1, and she had pulled it right through my open gate and parked in front of the house like she owned the approach. She wore a linen blazer over dark slacks and white sneakers that were already gathering dust from my gravel. The clipboard had a color photograph clipped behind the main sheet, a printed image of my barn with a hand-drawn red box around it in marker, as if the evidence might otherwise be hard to identify. The barn in question was red. Had been red since 1963, 60 years give or take, and it sat on 140 acres that predated her entire neighborhood by 4 decades and 2 years. What Sandra Vole did not know, and what she apparently had never once thought to verify before driving up my road with her clipboard and her compliance vocabulary, was that my parcel was deeded in October of 1961. 42 years before the Clearfield Ridge HOA charter was ever filed with the county clerk. That deed contained a covenant restriction written by my grandfather in plain English that explicitly barred any subsequently formed homeowners association from exercising aesthetic authority over the parcel. The HOA had no more jurisdiction over my barn than it had over the state highway 2 miles east. I want to ask you something before I go any further. If someone handed you a violation notice for a building you owned outright, on land your family had worked for 60 years, under a charter that had never legally applied to you for a single day of its existence, what would you do? Drop a comment. I want to know. Because what I did was tell her good morning, go back inside, pour a cup of coffee, and call my cousin Brenda at the county recorder's office. My name is Dale Mercer. I am 58 years old. For 30 years I called livestock auctions across the eastern Colorado foothills, which means I have a particular way of reading rooms, reading bids, and reading legal descriptions and property records faster than most people can read a lunch menu. I retired from the circuit 4 years ago when my wife Carol passed, and I came home to the ranch full-time. The place is 140 acres of mixed pasture and hay ground at the first real rise of the Rockies. Close enough that on clear mornings you can see the snow line on the ridges while you're drinking coffee on the porch. My grandfather Emmett bought it in 1961 with money he had saved over 20 years of irrigation work and a settlement from a boundary dispute he won in 1958. He and a neighbor and a borrowed post-hole digger built the original 2-stall barn in the spring of 1962. And they painted it red that summer with house paint from the hardware store in town. My father expanded the barn in 1979, adding 3 more stalls and a proper hayloft. Carol and I added the tack room in 1994, the year we got married. She mixed the barn red herself, matching the original siding, and we rolled it on over 2 weekends in late September. After the second weekend, we sat on the tailgate of the old flatbed with a couple of cold beers and watched the light go down behind the ridge. And Carol said that a red barn in a field was one of the few things on earth that looked exactly the way it was supposed to look. That barn had not been another color since the day Emmett first picked up a brush. The Clearfield Ridge subdivision was platted and recorded in 2003. It fills a 380-acre parcel on the eastern edge of my property line, a piece of ground that used to belong to a cattle operation that went belly up in the late 90s. Sandra's husband Glenn acquired the distressed land through his development company, Vole Development LLC, and spent 2 years subdividing it into 140 residential lots before he started selling. He installed the HOA as the Covenant and Common Area Manager, and the organization held its first board meeting in 2004. Sandra had been president since 2006, 9 years by the time she arrived in my driveway. She had, in those 9 years, apparently never had anyone tell her no in writing and make it stick. The clubhouse that served as the HOA's headquarters sat on a 1-acre parcel at the east end of the subdivision. Glenn's LLC retained ownership of that lot and leased it to the HOA for $1 a year. That was a detail buried in the LLC's operating records that I had no way of knowing yet. I found it out later, when it became the most important fact in the whole case. I gave Sandra's violation notice a careful review that October morning. Then I went through it again. I went to the hall closet and took the fireproof box off the shelf, the one Carol had bought at a hardware sale in 2001, the one we used for the ranch deed and the will and the insurance documents. I pulled my grandfather's original deed, found the recording date, and called Brenda. Brenda had worked the county recorder's window for 22 years. She knew the filing index the way I knew the auction ring. I asked her to pull the Clearfield Ridge HOA charter and compare the legal description in it to the legal description on my parcel deed. She called me back in 40 minutes. "Dale," she said, "your parcel number isn't in there, not even a footnote. The charter describes the subdivision plat, and your parcel is a separate instrument entirely. You're not in their document." I already knew that from my own reading. But there is a difference between knowing something and having the county recorder confirm it out loud. And I wrote down what Brenda said with the date and the time on a legal pad. I started a folder that morning. Manila, 2-inch brad fastener, labeled with a strip of masking tape. The date on the tab was October 14th. I put Sandra's violation notice in it, my deed copy, the covenant restriction highlighted in yellow, and my notes from Brenda. I put the folder on the desk in the ranch office and went outside to check the fence line along the south pasture, because the cattle needed the work done regardless of whatever she thought about my paint choices. My daughter Macy had been home when Sandra arrived. Macy was 16 then, a junior at the county high school, living with me full-time since her mother passed. She came out of the house that Tuesday morning just as the white SUV was pulling back out of the driveway and asked me what the woman wanted. "She doesn't like the color of the barn," I said. Macy looked at the barn, read as it had been every day of her life, then looked back at me. "That barn has always been red." "I know it," I said. "So what are you going to do?" "Document everything," I said. "And wait." She nodded like that was a completely reasonable answer, because in our house it was. Carol had kept the ranch records in labeled folders by year going back to 1988, the year she moved to the ranch after we married, and the habit had passed to both of us. Macy had grown up in a place where you filed things, and you kept copies, and you did not throw away paperwork with a date on it. The 30-day window passed. I did not repaint. The fees began. Sandra sent a certified letter on the 31st day, return receipt requested, informing me the daily assessment fees of $150 had begun accruing as of that date, and that she would be recording a lien against my property if the fees remained unpaid and the violation unaddressed after 60 additional days. The tone of the letter was formal and confident. She had clearly written letters like this before and had them work. I sent her a response the following week. 2 paragraphs, plain language. I cited the deed recording date, October 1961. I cited the HOA charter filing date, March 2003. I named the covenant restriction by its section and quoted the relevant sentence. I stated that the parcel did not appear in the charter's legal description and that the association had no authority to issue violation notices or assess fees against the property. I sent it certified mail with a return receipt requested. I kept the copy. When the green return card came back with her signature, I put it in the folder. She did not acknowledge my letter. The fees continued. I drove into town the following week and sat down with Frank Aldrich, a property attorney I knew from a water rights case he had handled for a neighboring ranch years before. Frank was methodical and unhurried, the kind of lawyer who reads every page before he says anything. He went through my materials for about 30 minutes, set them on his desk with his hands flat on top, and told me the HOA had no cognizable claim on my property under any legal theory he could identify. He said the covenant restriction was clear, the deed date was dispositive, and the absence of the parcel from the charter's legal description meant the association had issued a violation notice against property it had never had authority over. He said if they recorded a lien, I should file to vacate it immediately, and that the lien itself might constitute slander of title. He told me to keep every document they sent, keep copies of everything I sent them, and not to pay a single dollar. I asked him how long this kind of thing could go on. He said, as long as she thinks she can win. By the end of year 1, Sandra's paper tally stood at 63 assessed days, totaling $9,450 on her ledger. $0 collected. 0 ever would be. But the number was growing, and I wrote it in my notes each time she sent a new statement. The following spring, Sandra arrived at my property with a man she introduced as a regional aesthetic compliance inspector from the Community Standards Board. He had a clipboard, a digital camera, a polo shirt with an embroidered logo I did not recognize, and the practiced manner of someone who had performed this role enough times to feel comfortable in it. Sandra stood at the edge of my gravel drive in a cream blazer and dark slacks, sunglasses up on her head, arms folded over the clipboard like she was waiting for a contractor to confirm her kitchen renovation. He walked the driveway, photographed the barn from 3 angles, measured something at the foundation with a tape measure, and asked me in a professional tone when I planned to complete the remediation. I asked to see his credentials from the regional board. He produced a laminated card with the board's name and his name and a seal in the corner. I looked at it for a moment and photographed it with my phone before I handed it back. Sandra said, "As you can see, the board is taking a direct interest in bringing Clearfield Ridge into full compliance. This is not just an HOA matter anymore, Mr. Mercer. It's a regional standards matter." I told her that was interesting, and that I looked forward to seeing the board's filing in the state registry. She said, "I'm not sure what you mean by that." I told her I meant that I would be verifying the board's registration with the state, and that she should make sure the documentation was current. I said it in the same flat conversational tone I use when I'm describing a lot of cattle at auction. And the inspector looked at Sandra rather than at me, which I noted. That evening, I searched the state of Colorado's registered entities database and every accreditation registry I could locate. The Regional Community Standards Board did not appear in any of them. I ran the logo through a reverse image search. No results from any government or civic body. I searched the inspector's name against professional licensing records. Nothing. I put the photographs in the folder and wrote a note on the inside front cover in pen. Fake inspector, unregistered entity, date, physical description, vehicle plate. I wrote Sandra's exact words in quotation marks under the entry. Frank told me the following week that sending an individual onto my property under false pretense of regulatory authority was potentially criminal. He suggested I install security cameras. I had 2 up within the week, one covering the driveway approach from the gate to the house and one covering the full face of the barn. Both saved locally to a hard drive in the ranch office and simultaneously to a cloud backup service. 2 copies, always. Neither of them kept only on the property. By the end of year 2, Sandra's paper tally had reached $21,300. She had sent 2 more certified letters and 1 registered letter through Glenn's LLC attorney, a man named Bryce, who wrote in the same aspirational bureaucratese Sandra favored. I kept them all. My response to Bryce had been 1 paragraph citing the same 3 facts I had cited in every previous response, and I had received nothing back. Year 3 was when Sandra stopped limiting her pressure to me directly. I sold hay to 7 operations in the county, most of them families I had known for a decade or more. Starting in March of year 3, 2 of those customers called me within the same week with the same story. Sandra had reached out to them independently. She had presented herself as a community standards advocate and described my property as a non-compliant, holding in a protected aesthetic corridor. She suggested, in terms that both of them described as pointed without being explicit, that continuing business relationships with non-compliant property owners carried reputational risk for their own operations. One of them told me she had used the phrase community investment alignment. The other said she had arrived at his place in person, brought printed materials, and asked him to consider, as a neighbor and a member of the broader Clearfield Ridge community, whether he wanted his name associated with the dispute. A third customer, a woman named Diane, who ran a boarding operation out on the county road, called me 2 weeks after the other 2. Sandra had sent her a letter, formal stationery, Clearfield Ridge HOA letterhead, suggesting that her boarding facility's proximity to a non-compliant property could affect her operation's standing in a future regional zoning review. Diane recited the letter to me over the phone. I asked her to send me a copy. I called all 3 of them back the same day. I walked each of them through the deed date, the charter date, and the covenant restriction. I told them the Regional Community Standards Board was not a real entity. Diane laughed hard enough that I had to wait for her to settle. All 3 continued buying hay. All 3 wrote me letters describing what Sandra had said or written to them, signed and dated. Diane sent the original HOA letter along with her own account. I put all of it in the folder. By then, the folder required a second Brad to hold properly, and I had started keeping a typed index on the inside cover so I could find specific documents without reading through everything from the beginning. Frank filed a formal complaint with the county about the impersonator visit and sent a letter to the HOA's attorney of record placing Glenn's LLC and the association on notice of potential civil liability for harassment, interference with business relationships, and slander of title. I did not file suit yet. I was watching. It was Brenda who first mentioned the financial thread. She called me in late October of year 3, not about any filing at the recorder's office, but because she had heard from a friend at First Frontier Bank that Glen Voles Development Company was falling behind on a substantial commercial line of credit. 3 parcels were pledged as collateral. One of them, Brenda believed, from what she had been told, was the lot the HOA Clubhouse sat on. I thanked her and wrote it in my notes without acting on it. I did not know yet whether the information would matter. I wrote it down because that is what you do. Sandra filed an injunction petition in county court in November of year 3. Glenn's company attorney Bryce signed the filing as co-counsel. The petition asked a judge to compel me to repaint the barn, or, in the alternative, to grant the HOA authority to have it repainted and bill me for the cost and administration. The filing described my property as within the Clearfield Ridge aesthetic corridor, and my refusal to comply as causing material harm to residential property values in the subdivision. Frank filed a 14-page response. He cited the 1961 deed. He cited the covenant restriction in full. He produced Brenda's documented confirmation that my parcel number appeared nowhere in the HOA charter's legal description. He attached Tom's surveyor certification of the boundary lines. which showed the barn sitting 340 feet inside my property boundary with no physical relationship to any HOA, common area, or easement. He noted the pattern of conduct, the impersonator visit, the customer contacts, and the $27,150 in paper-assessed fees that had no legal foundation. He asked the court to consider whether the association had demonstrated a pattern of harassment against a property owner it had no jurisdiction over. The court took 5 months. When the ruling came, the judge dismissed the injunction petition with prejudice. Her written order noted that the petitioning association had produced no evidence that the subject parcel fell within its jurisdictional boundary, and that the petition lacked the foundational showing required to grant the relief requested. She did not use the word frivolous, but the dismissal with prejudice came close to the same meaning. Frank called me with the ruling on a Thursday morning. I thanked him, hung up, and wrote the dismissal date in my notes. I updated the paper-assessed fee count, which had reached $31,800. Then I filed the dismissal order in the folder and went out to check on the south pasture fence. There is a quality that some people who hold institutional authority develop over years of having it go unchallenged. It is not exactly arrogance, because arrogance is aware of itself. It is closer to a kind of operational certainty that the rules apply in the direction they always have applied, that the tools that worked before will keep working, that the people who have deferred will keep deferring. Sandra had been HOA president for 9 years and had, in those 9 years, collected fees from every property in her jurisdiction without a single successful challenge. A court dismissal, in her operational framework, was an obstacle to root around, not a verdict to accept. A Tuesday morning in late July, I was at the farm supply store in town, loading mineral blocks into the truck bed when my phone rang. It was Macy. Her voice was even and contained in the way it got when she was working hard to keep it that way. "Dad," she said, "there are 2 men in the driveway with paint rollers and a ladder." I asked her where she was. "Inside the house." I locked both doors. "They're setting up at the barn." I was in the truck before she finished the sentence. I told her to stay inside, stay away from the windows, and call me back if anyone approached the house. I kept her on the phone while I drove, and she talked to me in the same flat, steady voice, describing what she could hear. Truck doors, voices, the clatter of aluminum ladder sections. I was back on the property in 11 minutes. 2 men in polo shirts bearing the Vol Development LLC logo were positioned at the west face of the barn with extension ladders up and 5-gallon buckets of exterior white primer on the ground. They had not touched the siding. I was out of the truck while it was still settling, and I told them in one sentence to step away from the barn, that they were on private property without authorization, and that I was calling the county sheriff. One of them, the taller one with the ladder sections already braced, said they had instructions from the Clearfield Ridge HOA to perform the court-ordered remediation. I told him there was no court order. I told him the injunction petition had been dismissed with prejudice 4 months prior. I told him the paperwork to prove it was in my house, and I would be happy to show it to the deputy when he arrived. I said none of this loudly. I called the sheriff's dispatch. I also photographed both men, both trucks, both license plates, the ladders, the paint cans, the LLC logo on the shirts, and the position of the equipment against the barn wall. I did it methodically, the way you document a scene before it changes. Macy came out of the house when the patrol car came up the driveway. She stood beside me in the gravel without saying anything. Deputy Carver listened to my account, reviewed the dismissal order I had retrieved from the office, and then spoke with the 2 men. They told him they had been hired by Sandra and told the HOA had legal authority to perform the work. Deputy Carver told them the property owner had a prior court dismissal. The property owner's objection was documented and clear, and that absent a current and valid court order, their presence on the private property constituted trespass. He told them to load their equipment and leave the property. They loaded and left. Carver filed the trespass report that afternoon. I had my copies by Thursday. The report named both men, identified the LLC polo shirts, and noted the prior dismissal order as context. Everything went into the folder. Frank told me the incident had elevated the matter considerably. We were no longer in civil nuisance territory. The trespass, combined with the full documented pattern, was sufficient to pursue criminal referral for the false inspector visit, and potentially for this incident as well, if Sandra had directed the contractors while knowing about the dismissal order. He said the civil case for harassment, slander of title, trespass, and business interference was now very strong. He asked me how I wanted to proceed. I told him to hold the civil filing for a little while longer. There was something else I wanted to do first, and I needed Brenda to check one more thing. Brenda checked it that same week. Glen Voles LLC had not made its scheduled payment to First Frontier Bank in 3 months. The foreclosure process on the collateral parcels had been initiated. One of those parcels, confirmed now in the bank's public notice filing, was the 1-acre lot on which the HOA Clubhouse sat. The bank's foreclosure would proceed to public auction within 90 days under Colorado statute. I sat with that information for 2 days. Then I called Frank. I asked him to research the ownership chain on the Clubhouse parcel back to the original LLC filing. He confirmed within a week that Glen's LLC held title in fee simple. The HOA had never owned the ground it was sitting on. The organization had operated for 20 years on a lease from Glen's company, $1 per year, revocable if the LLC dissolved or defaulted. The bank's foreclosure would extinguish the lease and transfer the parcel to whoever purchased it at auction. Frank asked me what I had in mind. I told him I had a cashier's check question for him. The auction was on a Thursday morning in September, held in the courthouse parking lot the way Colorado conducts public property sales when the weather cooperates, with a posted legal notice and a folding table and whoever showed up having read the listings. I arrived in my good work boots and the ranch jacket with the collar turned up against the early chill. Frank stood to my left. I had a cashier's check in my inside pocket made out to the county. Sandra was there. She stood across the gravel lot with Glenn, who had the pale, tight look of a man watching something move faster than he could get ahead of it. He wore a sport coat over a collared shirt and had his phone in his hand, but was not looking at it. Sandra had her arms crossed and her clipboard absent for the first time in any encounter I had had with her. 3 neighbors from the subdivision were there as well. People I recognized from years of seeing their vehicles on the road past my fence line. The retired teacher Phil, who had always waved from his truck, was there, and 2 couples from the north end of the development, whose names I later learned were the Garcias and the Kowalskis. They stood together apart from Glenn and Sandra, which I noted. The bank's representative stated the opening bid at the outstanding debt balance, $118,400. I bid $119,000. Sandra said from across the lot, not quite under her breath, "He's not going to." There were 2 other bids from parties I did not know, likely investors who read the foreclosure listings without any stake in the outcome. I went to $127,500 on the 3rd round. The gavel came down. Sandra said loudly this time, "You can't do this. That's HOA property." The bank's man at the table did not look up from his paperwork. Frank did not move or speak. Phil, the retired teacher, looked at Sandra and then at me, and I saw him register what had just happened. I signed the transfer documents at the folding table. The parcel deed recorded that same afternoon at the county recorder's office. Brenda confirmed the recording number to me by phone at 4:17. The 1-acre lot on which the Clearfield Ridge HOA Clubhouse stood was now mine. The special HOA meeting had been called 3 weeks before the auction, before Sandra knew about the sale, because Frank had filed the formal complaints about the trespass incident and the full documented pattern with the county sheriff's office and with the state attorney general's Consumer Protection Division. A financial crimes investigator from the AG's office had been assigned. Between the trespass documentation and the pattern across 4 years, there was enough for the investigators to request the meeting as part of a formal inquiry, and to subpoena Glenn's LLC financial records as part of a broader review of the development company's conduct across multiple properties. I arrived at the clubhouse that I now owned at 6:45 in the evening. Frank came with me. The county sheriff, his supervising sergeant, and the financial crimes investigator from the AG's office were already seated in a row along the back wall. Sandra was at the front at the lectern, and she was in the middle of sorting papers when I walked in. She looked up and saw Frank. She looked at the officers. She looked at me. She set her papers down flat on the lectern with a careful motion that I recognized as a person recalibrating very fast. She had dressed for a meeting she thought she controlled. Linen blazer again, the pearls, the lanyard with the HOA logo. She looked exactly as she had the first day she drove through my gate 4 years before. Except that she was standing in a building I had bought 72 hours earlier, and everyone in the room except her had known that before they arrived. The meeting was called to order by the HOA treasurer, not Sandra. The treasurer was a soft-spoken man named Walt, who looked like he had not slept well in some time. That was the first signal. I learned afterward that 2 board members had hired personal attorneys, and a third had formally resigned the week before, sending a written letter that cited, in her own language, concerns about the association's conduct under the current leadership. The organization was fracturing in the room while the treasurer was still calling the meeting to order. Phil, the retired teacher from the auction, was in the audience. The Garcias were there. Half the subdivision seemed to have heard about the auction result and wanted to see what followed. I waited until Walt acknowledged me before I stood. I carried the folder to the table at the front and set it down. I opened it without hurrying. I laid Tom's stamped plat survey on the table first, the one showing my 140 acres and the barn's position 340 feet inside my boundary, with the subdivision plat adjacent and the gap between them clear as a fence line. Under it, I set my grandfather's deed with the recording date October 14th, 1961, flagged with a sticky tab, and the covenant restriction sentence underlined in red. Under that, the HOA charter with the filing date of March 2003, and the legal description that contained no trace of my parcel. Under that, the court dismissal with prejudice. Under that, the trespass report with Deputy Carver's signature and the LLC polo shirt notation. Under that, the certified mail return receipts going back to year 1. Under that, the letters from my 3 hay customers. Under that, Diane's original HOA letterhead correspondence. Under that, at the very bottom of the stack, the county auction transfer deed bearing that afternoon's recording date and the parcel number for the 1-acre lot on which we were all standing. I set that one face up on the table and stepped back. The room was quiet. Phil, in the 3rd row, leaned slightly forward. The HOA's new attorney cleared his throat. He was a man named Davis, who had received the full case file exactly 16 days before, and had clearly spent most of those 16 days reading it with increasing discomfort. He addressed the board directly and did not look at Sandra while he spoke. He said that based on the materials before him, the subject parcel had never been under HOA jurisdiction under any of the organization's founding documents. He said the fee notices going back 4 years had no legal basis and could not be collected. He said the trespass incident carried civil and potentially criminal exposure for any party who had directed it knowing of the prior court dismissal. He said the organization was in a materially difficult legal position and that individual board members should consult personal counsel before the meeting concluded. He stopped. The room stayed quiet. Sandra looked at the stack of documents on the table. She looked at the transfer deed on top. She said, in a voice that had lost the last of its compliance officer register, "How long have you had all of this?" She meant the deed. She meant the covenant restriction. I understood exactly what she was asking. She had assumed I was a homeowner who had found a defense after she attacked. The thing she could not process, even standing in front of the evidence, was that I had always had it. My grandfather had filed it 62 years before she drove through my gate. It had been in the fireproof box in my hall closet every day of the dispute, waiting for the moment she was standing in front of it. Nobody answered her. The meeting dissolved within 40 minutes. Walt adjourned it from the front table without looking at anyone in particular. The State Attorney General's inquiry into Vole Development, LLC, expanded across the following months. The investigators found what they found, which was a pattern across 3 developments where Glenn's company had represented common area parcel ownership to home buyers without disclosing that the parcels were pledged loan collateral subject to foreclosure. The consent order issued 14 months later required dissolution of 3 subsidiary entities and restitution of $214,000 to affected home buyers. Glenn's name appeared on the consent order twice. Sandra resigned the HOA presidency 11 days after the meeting. The board met twice more without a quorum and stopped meeting. The organization filed a formal dissolution notice with the county recorder 26 weeks after the auction. Brenda confirmed the filing number to me the morning it processed. The dissolution notice is a public record. Anyone can pull it. The fee notices Sandra had sent, totaling $31,800 over 4 years on her ledger, were confirmed by the HOA's own attorney as uncollectible and legally void. $0 had ever been paid. That is how the account stood at the end. I did not sell the clubhouse lot. I rented the building to the county saddle club for their monthly meetings at a fair market rate that covered my property taxes and maintenance, with enough left to run a small hay subsidy for local 4-H kids. Before the first rental, I had the exterior repainted. The color I chose was a soft coral pink, warm enough to read as deliberate in the morning light, close enough to barn red that a person standing on the hill between my pasture and the old subdivision lot could look from one building to the other and understand what they were looking at. The Saddle Club members asked me once about the color. I told them it was an aesthetic choice and that I had made it in full compliance with all applicable property standards as recorded in my deed. Macy was with me the afternoon the painters packed up and drove out. She stood at the fence line between the 2 properties, the old Saddle Club building on one side and the red barn on the other, and looked at both of them for a long time without saying anything. Then she said, "Mom would have loved this." She was right. Carol had a particular satisfaction she saved for outcomes that required patience and correct paperwork. She would have appreciated the sequence of it. The folder started the day of the first notice, the deed that had been in the fireproof box since 1961, the 4 years of filing, the moment in the courthouse parking lot with the cashier's check. She would have appreciated the color. I went inside and put the folder in the fireproof box next to Emmett's original deed, where it belongs. Here is what I want you to take from this. When an HOA sends you a violation notice, the first thing you do is pull your deed and find the recording date, not the date on the cover sheet, the actual recorded date stamped by the county clerk. Then pull the HOA's charter from your county recorder's office and find the date on that document. If your deed is older than the charter, look at the legal description in the charter and find your parcel number. If your parcel number is not in their founding document, every notice they send you is paper without authority behind it. Your county recorder's office has both documents. In most counties, the search is free and takes less than an hour. The second thing is to keep every notice, every letter, every certified mail receipt. File them in order with dates. That folder is your case, and it builds itself one escalation at a time. The documentation does not make the case at the end. It is the case. The third thing is this. When someone is pressing you hard on a property dispute and they seem very certain, ask who owns the ground they are standing on. Not who runs the organization, who owns the land under the building. Because sometimes the answer to that question is the only answer that matters. If you have a story like this one, drop it in the comments below. I read everyone. If these stories are worth your time, subscribe so you catch the next one. Next up is a woman whose family fishing pond gets reclassified as HOA common water until she pulls out the original Army Corps of Engineers easement her father filed in 1971. That one ends at a county water board hearing, and it ends decisively. I will see you then. See you